Ladies, it is Madam Reed. Tonight's story begins with a $14 latte and a folder on a marble table. On one side, a woman in a cardigan, sitting in the coffee shop her husband chose, neutral territory dressed up as taste, listening to him offer her the house, the car, his clean conscience, and 9 years of her own life handed back to her like a receipt she didn't ask for. On the other, a man with a rehearsed expression and a generous offer, convinced he was walking away clean, convinced he was the one doing the leaving. He thought he was handing her a gift. He was handing her the evidence. Let's begin. I want to be fair to you, Marcus said. The way he said it, so careful, so rehearsed, told me everything I needed to know about how long he'd been practicing that sentence. We were sitting in the kind of coffee shop that charges $14 for a latte and plays jazz no one actually listens to. Marcus had chosen it. He always chose places like this, neutral territory dressed up as taste. The air conditioning was aggressive. I'd worn a cardigan. He was stirring his Americano. No sugar. He'd given up sugar 2 years ago, around the same time he started coming home, 40 minutes later than usual, and showering before dinner instead of after. I noticed. I always noticed. The house, he said. It is yours, the car too. I'll walk away clean. He said clean, like it was a virtue, like he was doing me a favor by leaving. I set my cup down. That small sound, ceramic on marble, made him look up. I let him look. He had the expression of a man who had already written the ending to this story and was waiting for me to read my lines, the guilty tilt of his chin, the careful softness around his eyes. He'd probably practiced that too in the bathroom mirror, the same mirror I'd stood in front of every morning for 9 years. 9 years of being Nora Whitmore, which had never quite fit the way a name should fit, the way your own name fits when you've grown into it. I've got you, he'd said. The first night we met, he'd held the car door open and said it like a promise. I'd believed him the way you believe things when you are 33, and someone looks at you like you are the only person in the room. I picked up my cup again, took a sip, put it back down. Okay, I said. He blinked. Okay, Marcus, I'll take the house and the car. The rehearsed softness flickered. He'd been braced for tears, for raised voices, for the dramatic confrontation he could later describe to Tessa as proof of how difficult I was, how unreasonable, how he'd had no choice. I gave him none of that. You are. He stopped, started again. You are not going to ask me anything, shuled I. He shifted in his seat, picked up his spoon. Put it down. I just thought you'd want to talk about it. We are talking about it. Nora, Marcus. He exhaled through his nose. That particular exhale, I knew it well. It meant he felt he was being handled, and he didn't like it, and he couldn't quite figure out why. Her name is Tessa, he said. As if I'd asked, as if saying her name out loud made this more honest. She is. We didn't plan it, it just. You don't need to explain. I feel like I do. You don't. I reached into my bag, placed a folder on the table between us, turned so he could read it right side up. I had the agreement drafted this morning. Property division is exactly as you described. The house, the car, your voluntary relinquishment of any further financial claims. He stared at it. The folder sat there between our coffee cups like a small, quiet bomb. You had this. He picked it up, turned the pages. His hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. You already had this drawn up. I am efficient. Nora, this is. He looked up. For the first time since we'd sat down, he was looking at me like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. When did you? How long have you known? I didn't answer that. I took a pen from my bag and placed it on top of the folder. Sign on page 4 and page 7, I said. I've already signed both copies. You keep one, I keep one. We can file tomorrow morning if you are available, or I can handle it myself if you are busy. He kept staring at me. I could see him recalculating, running back through the last several months, looking for the moment he'd missed, the tell he'd overlooked. He wouldn't find it, not because I'd been careful, though I had been, but because he'd never really been looking. Men like Marcus never look at the furniture. They just expect it to stay where they put it. He picked up the pen. I watched him sign his name on page 4, then page 7. The signature was slightly different from his usual one, a little too fast, a little too pressured. He was rattled and trying not to show it. Nora, he slid the folder back across. Are you okay? The question landed somewhere in my chest and sat there, heavy and useless. Are you okay? 9 years. A pregnancy we didn't keep because the timing wasn't right, because his fund was in its critical growth phase, because he'd said we'll have another chance, a better one, I promise. 9 years of managing his calendar and his household and his image at every dinner party and charity event, of making myself smaller in rooms where he needed to be the largest thing. 9 years of being the woman behind the man, which is a poetic way of saying I was the wall he built himself against. And walls don't get asked if they're okay. I am fine. I tucked my copy of the agreement into my bag, finished the last of my coffee, stood up, smoothed my cardigan. I'll text you the appointment time for tomorrow, I said. Bring your ID and the marriage certificate. Everything else is already in order. I left him sitting there with his unsigned Americano and his rehearsed expression, and the slowly dawning realization that something had just happened that he didn't have a name for yet. Outside, the afternoon light was sharp and clean. I walked half a block before I stopped, put my hand flat against the warm brick of a building, and breathed. Just breathe, because here is what Marcus didn't know. Sitting in that coffee shop with his generous offer and his clean conscience, the house he'd handed me was carrying $430,000 in undisclosed mortgage debt. The car had a lien on it he'd never mentioned, and his fund, that gleaming, carefully branded fund he'd spent 9 years building and I'd spent 9 years supporting, was held together with wire and optimism and other people's money he'd been quietly borrowing against. He thought he was handing me a gift. He'd handed me the receipt for everything he'd ever done. My phone buzzed. A message from Rebecca, my attorney. Done for today, I typed back, he signed. See you tomorrow, her reply came in seconds. Good. The rest is already in motion. I put my phone in my pocket and kept walking, into the sharp afternoon light, away from the coffee shop and the jazz. No one listens to, and the 9 years I was finally done carrying. Then Dorothy called. She must have known. Marcus must have told her, or she'd read it in the particular way he'd gone quiet on the phone the past few weeks, the way mothers read their sons even when their sons think they're unreadable. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice she used at holiday dinners when she was navigating something she didn't want to name directly. Nora, she said, I heard Dorothy. A pause. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I feel like I should. Another pause longer. He is my son. I love him. But I know, she stopped, started again. I know this isn't what you deserved. It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in 9 years. I stood on the pavement with the afternoon light going gold around me and didn't know what to do with it. Thank you, Dorothy, I said. I appreciate that. We said goodbye with the careful politeness of two women who had never quite found their way to each other and now probably never would. I hung up and stood there for a moment, holding the phone. Then I kept walking. The rest, as Rebecca said, was already in motion. Marcus just didn't know it yet. The divorce clerk had a small ceramic succulent on her desk, and the practiced neutrality of someone who had watched 1,000 marriages end before lunch. She asked us the standard questions. Marcus answered in the careful, measured tone he used in board meetings. I answered in the tone I used for everything now. Flat, factual, done. When she stamped the final document, Tessa made a sound. It wasn't words. It was the sound of someone who had been holding something in for a very long time and couldn't anymore. A sharp, bright exhale, almost a laugh. She was standing just behind Marcus's left shoulder, where she'd positioned herself the entire morning. Close enough to touch, but not quite, marking territory she didn't fully own yet. She was younger than I'd expected. Not in age, I knew she was 29, but in the way she held herself. There was something unfinished about her, like a sentence that trails off. She was pretty in the way that requires a great deal of effort and reads up close as anxiety. She grabbed Marcus's arm the moment the clerk handed back the documents. "We should celebrate," she said, loud enough for the people in the next booth to hear. "Finally, right?" Marcus smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. I put my copy of the divorce decree in my bag, next to the white ceramic coffee cup I'd brought from home that morning. My mother's cup, the one I'd been drinking from every day for 11 years. The one Marcus had never once touched because he didn't like the size of the handle. I'd brought it with me the way you bring a talisman. Something to hold on to when the ground shifts. "Nora," Marcus caught me at the door. Tessa was still at the counter, photographing her copy of the decree for reasons I chose not to examine. "The property transfer paperwork. Rebecca's office will contact you this week." "Right," he nodded, looked at me with that expression again, the one I'd seen in the coffee shop, the recalculating look. "I am fine, Marcus." I was going to say, "You seem like yourself." I looked at him for a moment. "I am myself," I said. "I've been myself the whole time, you just weren't paying attention." I left before he could answer. I spent the rest of that day taking apart 9 years. It is a strange kind of work, methodical and brutal in equal measure. I started in the bedroom, his side of the closet, the suits arranged by color, the way he liked, the drawer of cufflinks he'd accumulated at conferences and charity dinners. I packed everything into boxes with the focused efficiency of someone diffusing something. I didn't let myself feel it, not yet. The first time I found something wrong, it was a Tuesday in November, 2 years ago. I'd been reconciling the household accounts, something I did every month, a habit from my years at the firm, and there was a transfer I didn't recognize, $4,000 to an account I'd never seen. I wrote the number down on a piece of paper, folded it, put it in an envelope, and filed it in the back of the drawer where I kept the insurance documents. I didn't confront him, I waited. There were more envelopes after that. I was in his study when I found the notebook. It was in the bottom drawer of his desk, under a copy of a business plan he'd never executed, and a lease agreement for an office space he'd apparently rented and never mentioned. The notebook was small, dark green, the kind you buy at an airport. His handwriting inside was cramped and fast, the way he wrote when he was stressed. It was a record, not a complete one, Marcus was too careful for that, but enough to see the shape of things. Loans from private individuals, deferred payments, a name that appeared 3 times in the margins, circled, VY, photographed every page. Then I sat back in his desk chair and looked at the room around me, the frame deal announcements on the wall, the shelf of business books with their spines uncracked, the photo of us at a vineyard in Sonoma, the one he kept because it photographed well, because we looked like the kind of couple that belonged in a frame. I took the photo down, put it face down on the desk. Then I opened my phone and sent the photographs to 4 numbers. 2 were people Marcus had borrowed money from, people I'd met at dinner parties, people who'd shaken my hand and called me the lucky one. 1 was his business partner, a man named Gerald, who had appeared in the financial records often enough that I suspected he had questions of his own. The 4th number was Rebecca. Her response came within minutes. "This is the notebook. This is what we needed." I put the phone down outside the study window. The neighbor's dog was barking at something in the hedge. The afternoon light was going gold and long across the floor. Somewhere in this house, in the walls, in the carpet fibers, in the particular way the 3rd stair creaked, 9 years of my life were still living, and I was about to hand all of it back. I thought about the cup in my bag. My mother's cup. I thought about how she used to say that the things worth keeping were the things that had been used, really used, worn smooth by hands in mornings and ordinary days. She'd asked me, the last time we spoke, whether I was happy. Her voice had been careful, the way it got when she already suspected the answer. "Of course," I'd told her. She'd been quiet for a moment, then she'd said, "Okay, sweetheart." Just that. She died 4 months later, and I never told her the truth, and I have thought about that almost every day since. I stood up, closed the notebook, put it back exactly where I'd found it. I had what I needed. The rest could stay. I carried the last box of Marcus's things to the front door, called a courier, and gave them his office address. I paid the delivery fee in cash then. I went to the kitchen, took my mother's cup out of my bag, filled it with the last of the good coffee, the kind Marcus had ordered from a specialty roaster in Vermont. $60 a bag, which I had always thought was absurd and had drunk anyway, and sat down at the kitchen table in the quiet. The house felt different already, lighter, maybe, or just emptier. Sometimes those feel the same. My phone rang, unknown number. "Is this the Hale residence?" A man's voice, flat and unhurried in the way of someone who makes calls like this for a living. "There is no Hale residence anymore," I said. "Who are you looking for?" A pause. "Marcus Hale." "He doesn't live here." Another pause, longer. "When did that change?" "Today," I said. "You might want to update your records." I hung up, Saturday, with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I opened my texts and wrote to Rebecca. First one just called. "It is starting." She wrote back, "Right on schedule. How are you holding up?" I looked around the kitchen, at the empty hook where Marcus's keys used to hang, at the clean counter where his coffee maker had been. I'd packed it with his things, kept my mother's old stovetop percolator instead. At the window above the sink, where the light came in every morning at an angle that had always made me feel, briefly, that everything was going to be fine. I typed, "Ask me again in a week." Put the phone face down on the table, picked up my mother's cup with both hands, drank my coffee in the quiet. Outside, the neighbor's dog had stopped barking. The light through the window was doing its thing, that particular slant of late afternoon gold that doesn't last long and doesn't need to. I let myself have it for exactly as long as it lasted. Then I got up, rinsed the cup, and went back to work. The phone rang at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. I was already awake. I'd been awake for an hour, sitting at the kitchen table with Rebecca's case notes spread in front of me and a cup of tea that had gone cold. The number on the screen was one I didn't recognize. "A local area code, no name," I answered. "Marcus Hale." The voice was male, unhurried, the kind of flat that isn't calm so much as practiced. "Put him on. He doesn't live here." "Lady, I am not in the mood. Put him on." "I am not sure how to make this clearer," I said. "Marcus Hale and I finalized our divorce 3 days ago. This is my home. He is not in it. If you have business with him, I'd suggest finding a more current address." A long pause. The kind where you can hear someone deciding something. You got a number for him. I do not. Another pause. Then you'll be hearing from us again. I look forward to it, I said, and hung up. I wrote the time and the number in the margin of Rebecca's notes. Then I made a fresh cup of tea, sat back down, and kept reading. The calls came in a particular order, which told me something about how news travels. First were the creditors, impersonal, procedural, mildly threatening. They wanted Marcus. When I told them Marcus was gone, they wanted to know what assets remained at this address. I referred them to Rebecca's office and hung up. Then came the people who knew him. His sister called on a Wednesday morning, her voice carrying that specific register of someone who has just been told something they're not sure they believe. Nora, someone sent me some documents about Marcus's fund. What kind of documents? Financial ones, they look. She stopped. Are they real? I wouldn't know, I said. I've been out of Marcus's financial picture since the divorce. But you must know something. You lived with him for 9 years. I did, I said. And in my experience, the documents that look real usually are. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, smaller, younger. He borrowed money from our parents. Nora, $40,000. They thought it was an investment. I didn't say anything. Was it an investment? Call Rebecca Holt? I said, she is my attorney. She can point you toward the right resources. I gave her the number. I am sorry, Diane. I genuinely am. I hung up and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, watching a sparrow work at something in the garden. I was sorry. That part was true. Diane had always been kind to me in the distracted way of someone with her own life to manage. She hadn't known. Most of them hadn't known. That was the thing about men like Marcus. They were very good at making sure the people who loved them were also the last to find out Gerald. The business partner called that afternoon. He didn't bother with the notebook, he said. You sent it to me. I don't know what you are referring to. Nora. His voice was tight. I've been Marcus's partner for 6 years. If what is in those photographs is accurate, I have exposure here. Significant exposure. I need to know what you know. Gerald, I am not in a position to discuss Marcus's business affairs. I'd strongly recommend you speak with your own attorney. I have an attorney. My attorney is telling me to cooperate with any ongoing investigation. A beat. Is there an ongoing investigation? I looked at Rebecca's notes on the table, at the name V that appeared in Marcus's notebook, circled 3 times, at the figure written next to it, a number with enough zeros to make the room feel smaller. I genuinely don't know, I said, which was true. Technically, I knew there would be. I didn't know the timeline. If you are sitting on something, Gerald, call your attorney. That is all I can tell you. I ended the call, sat her down, picked up my pen, and added his name to the margin of my notes. The picture was filling in the way a photograph develops, slowly. Then all at once, the letter arrived on a Thursday. It came in a cream-colored envelope with a law firm's name embossed in the upper left corner. The kind of envelope designed to communicate seriousness before you've even opened it. I recognized the firm Aldridge and Crane, one of the most expensive litigation practices in the city. Marcus had mentioned them once at a dinner party in the tone he used for things he considered out of reach. Apparently, he'd reconsidered. I read the letter standing at the kitchen counter. Then I read it again, sitting down. The language was precise and dense, the way legal language is when it is trying to bury the actual meaning. But the actual meaning was this. Marcus, through Aldridge and Crane, was filing a motion to reopen the property settlement. His grounds were that I had concealed premarital assets during the divorce proceedings, and that the settlement agreement had been signed under conditions that did not reflect the full financial picture of the marriage. He'd found a thread and he was pulling it. The rain had been coming down for an hour the first time I found the discrepancy. I'd been at the desk in the study, the household accounts open on the laptop, a glass of wine going warm beside me. The number didn't match. $4,000, gone sideways into an account I didn't recognize. I'd written it down, folded the paper, filed it away. I told myself I was being careful. What I was actually being was afraid. Afraid of what finding more would mean, afraid of what I'd have to do with it. I put the letter down on the counter. Rebecca answered on the second ring. "I got it too," she said before I could speak. "They messengered a copy to my office this morning. Aldridge and Crane." "I know." A pause. "He found a good lawyer, Nora. This is going to get messy." The kitchen felt very quiet outside. It had started to rain, a thin, persistent drizzle that blurred the garden into soft shapes. "How messy?" I asked. "Messy enough that we need to talk about the full picture, everything you have, not just the notebook." Another pause, and I could hear her choosing her words. "If he gets this motion in front of the right judge, and if Aldridge and Crane argue it the way I think they're going to argue it, they're going to paint you as someone who manipulated a vulnerable man into signing away his rights during an emotionally compromised moment." He wasn't vulnerable. I know that. You know that. But vulnerable is a story, Nora, and Aldridge and Crane are very good at stories. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a careful professional concern that she was trying not to let become alarm. They have resources we don't. They will drag this out. That is their strategy. Make it expensive enough and exhausting enough that you settle. I stood at the window. The rain was coming harder now, flattening the garden. "What do we do?" I asked. "We don't settle," Rebecca said, "and we use everything." After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. The rain kept coming. The garden kept blurring. My tea went cold again, and I didn't notice. I thought about the folder I'd been keeping for 6 months. The one I hadn't shown Rebecca yet. The one I'd told myself I was saving for a situation exactly like this. A draft document I'd found on Marcus's laptop 14 months ago, open in a browser tab he'd forgotten to close. A stock transfer agreement. His remaining company shares, the ones not yet pledged as collateral, being transferred quietly, cleanly, before any of the creditors could reach them, to a holding account in Tessa's name. He'd been planning this longer than I'd known. I went to the desk, opened the bottom drawer, took out the folder, Saturday with it in my hands for a moment, in the quiet kitchen, in the rain. Then I opened my laptop and wrote Rebecca one line. "There is something else. I'll bring it tomorrow." I closed the laptop, picked up my cold tea, drank it anyway. Outside, the rain showed no sign of stopping. Neither did I. The crack was so small I almost missed it. I was standing at the kitchen counter at 6 in the morning, holding my mother's white cup up to the light the way you do when you are not really looking at the thing you are looking at. The hairline fracture ran from the base to just below the rim, thin as a thread, pale against the glaze. It could have been there for months. It could have been there for years. I'd been drinking from it every morning without knowing it was broken. I set it down carefully, stood there. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, and I didn't get up for a long time. This is the part I don't tell people. Not Rachel, not Rebecca, not the version of myself I'd been performing for the past 3 weeks. The composed one, the prepared one, the one who had a folder for every contingency and a response for every phone call. That version of me was real. I want to be clear about that. The preparation was real. The strategy was real. The anger that had been quietly fueling all of it for the better part of 2 years was absolutely real. But so was this, The floor. The early morning, the cup with the crack in it that I hadn't noticed. Rebecca had called the night before to walk me through what Aldridge and Crane were likely to argue. She'd been measured and precise, the way she always was. But I'd heard the thing underneath the precision, the part where she said they have resources we don't, and meant it as a warning. Marcus's legal team would file motions. They would request discovery. They would schedule depositions and postpone them and reschedule them, running the clock, running up costs, betting that at some point I would decide that settling was cheaper than winning. And the thing I hadn't said to Rebecca, the thing I'd been not saying for 3 weeks, was this. They might be right not about the merits, about the math. Me savings, the money I'd been careful to document as premarital, the money my mother and father had given me before they died, the money I'd protected with every legal instrument Rebecca could construct, was not infinite. It was substantial. It was enough. But a prolonged litigation against Aldridge and Crane, billed at their hourly rates with their appetite for procedural delay. I'd done the math at 2 a.m. more than once. The numbers were not comfortable, and underneath the math was something I hadn't let myself look at directly. Her voice on the phone the last time. "Are you happy, Nora?" Her voice had been careful, the way it got when she already suspected the answer. "Of course," I told her. She'd gone quiet in that way she had, the way that meant she was deciding whether to push. She didn't push, she said, "Okay, sweetheart." And we talked about something else, and 4 months later she was gone, and I never told her the truth, which was, no. Not for a long, maybe not since the year we lost the pregnancy, and I told myself it was fine, we were fine, there would be another chance, and I believed it because I needed to believe something. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. The pregnancy, I hadn't let myself think about it directly in months. I'd been too busy, too focused, too carefully pointed toward the future to look sideways at that particular piece of the past. But it was there. It had always been there, the way certain losses are. Not loud, not dramatic, just permanently present. Like a piece of furniture you've arranged your whole life around without ever acknowledging why the room is shaped the way it is. We'd been married 2 years. I was 35. Marcus had just closed the fund's second round of financing and was in what he called the critical growth phase, which meant he was working 18-hour days and coming home wired and distracted and already somewhere else in his head. When I told him, he'd gone very still. Then he'd said, "The timing isn't great." Not "I am scared." Not "give me a minute." The timing isn't. I'd told myself he was in shock. I'd told myself he'd come around. I'd told myself a lot of things in those 2 weeks, and then I'd made the appointment, and he'd driven me there and waited in the car. And when I came back down, he'd squeezed my hand and said, "We'll do it right next time, I promise." And I'd nodded and looked out the window the whole drive home. There was no next time. I don't know exactly when I understood that. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like a slow change in light, the way a room gets darker in the late afternoon without you noticing, until suddenly you realize you've been sitting in the dark. On the kitchen floor, I started crying. Not the controlled kind, not the kind you do in the shower with the water running, so no one hears, the ugly kind. The kind that comes from somewhere below your ribs and doesn't ask permission. I sat there with my back against the cabinet and my mother's cracked cup on the counter above me, and I cried for the pregnancy, and for my mother, and for the 33-year-old woman who'd believed someone when he said, "I've got you," and for the 9 years I'd spent making myself useful and invisible and indispensable to a man who'd been planning his exit while I organized his filing system. I cried until I didn't have anything left. Then I sat in the quiet for a while. The morning light was coming through the window at its usual angle. The garden was doing its usual thing. A car went past on the street outside. Then another. The world was entirely indifferent to what had just happened on my kitchen floor, which was, I found, a relief. I reached up and took the cup down from the counter. held it in both hands, looked at the crack. It was still there. Of course it was still there. But the cup was still a cup. It had held things for 11 years with that crack in it or some version of it, and I hadn't known. And the coffee had been fine. I thought about my mother, about the way she kept things, not out of sentimentality. She wasn't a sentimental woman, but out of a kind of practical respect for objects that had proven themselves. If it still works, she used to say, my knees were stiff, my face felt tight and swollen. I filled the kettle, put it on, stood at the window while it heated, and I thought about the folder. The one I hadn't shown Rebecca yet. The draft stock transfer agreement, Marcus's shares, quietly being moved into Tessa's name before the creditors could reach them. I'd found it 14 months ago on a browser tab he'd left open, printed it, locked it in the fireproof box under the bed where I kept my passport and my mother's jewelry. I'd been saving it, waiting for the right moment. The right moment, it turned out, was when Aldridge and Crane filed their motion. Because here was what Marcus had miscalculated. In his careful, self-assured way, he thought the folder I'd given Rebecca was everything. He thought he'd seen my hand. He'd looked at what I'd shown him and decided he understood the shape of what I had, and he'd built his legal strategy around that shape. He was wrong. He'd spent 9 years watching me manage the household and assuming that was the full extent of what I was doing. He'd handed me every bank statement, every account summary, every financial document that came through the door because I was the one who filed things, and filing things was domestic work. And domestic work was invisible. He'd watched me be invisible for 9 years and concluded that I was what he forgot. What men like Marcus always forget is that invisible isn't the same as absent. I was in that house. I was at that desk. Every document that came through the door came through my hands first. I knew the shape of his finances the way I knew the layout of the rooms, not because I'd studied it, but because I'd lived in it every day for 9 years. What he called compliance was me quietly learning the architecture of everything he was trying to hide. The kettle boiled. I made tea, stood at the counter and drank it while it was still too hot, which I never do, but I needed to feel something specific and immediate. Then I went to the bedroom, pulled the fireproof box from under the bed, took out the folder Saturday at the desk and read through it one more time, slowly, the way you read something when you are deciding to use it. Then I opened my laptop and wrote to Rebecca, "There is something else. I'll bring it tomorrow. It changes the shape of everything." I sent it before I could reconsider, closed the laptop, picked up my mother's cup, the cracked one, the only one, and carried it to the windowsill where the morning light could reach it. Set it there. It looked fine, better than fine. Actually, the light caught the glaze and made it glow, and the crack was just a line, just a mark that said this has been used, this has been held, this has been here. I got dressed. I had work to do. Living my best life, Tessa had written. Above a photograph of herself, in what appeared to be a hotel rooftop pool, somewhere warm, the kind of blue sky that costs money. The post was 3 days old. She was wearing sunglasses that I recognized, a pair Marcus had brought home from a work trip to Milan 2 years ago, telling me he'd bought them at the airport. He'd said they were for me. They weren't my size. I looked at the photo for approximately 4 seconds. Then I put my phone face down on the desk and called Rebecca. She'd read the folder by 7 that morning. By the time I arrived at her office at 9, she'd read it 3 times and had a yellow legal pad covered in notes. Rebecca was the kind of attorney who still used yellow legal pads, which I had always found reassuring. It suggested she was thinking, not just processing. "Sit down," she said before I'd fully closed the door. I sat. She turned the legal pad toward me at the top. Underlined twice, she'd written. Premeditated asset concealment. prior to divorce filing. "This draft agreement," she said, tapping the folder. "If this is what I think it is, and I've been doing this for 19 years, so I am fairly confident it is." Marcus began moving his unencumbered assets into Tessa Vale's name at least 14 months before you filed, before he even told you about her. She looked at me over her reading glasses. "He wasn't just cheating on you, Nora. He was building an exit architecture. Systematically. I know. You knew 14 months ago. I suspected 14 months ago. I said, I knew when I saw the full debt picture. The asset transfers only make sense if you understand what he was trying to protect them from." Rebecca sat back, looked at me with an expression I'd seen on her face before, not quite admiration, more like the professional satisfaction of someone who has just been handed exactly the right tool at exactly the right moment. "Aldridge and Crane filed their motion yesterday afternoon. She said they're arguing you concealed premarital assets and manipulated the settlement process." She paused. "I am going to argue that their client engaged in a 14-month premeditated scheme to defraud both his creditors and his spouse, and that this document," she tapped the folder again, "is the evidence. I am going to file a counter motion by end of week, and I am going to copy the DA's office." The room was very quiet for a moment. "Will it work?" I asked. "The counter motion?" "Yes." She picked up her pen. "Aldridge and Crane are good, but they're not miracle workers. They can't argue their client was acting in good faith when we have a draft transfer agreement dated 14 months ago." She made a note. "Their motion dies probably within 3 weeks. And the DA." She looked at me steadily. "That depends on what else is in that notebook and on what Gerald decides to do." Gerald decided quickly, as it turned out. He called Rebecca's office that same afternoon. He had, as he'd told me, his own attorney. His own attorney had apparently told him the same thing Rebecca had told me: cooperate and cooperate first. Gerald had records of his own internal fund communications, wire transfer confirmations, a paper trail that corroborated everything in Marcus's notebook. And then some. Marcus had been borrowing against the fund's assets for almost 3 years. Not borrowing, exactly. That word implies an intention to repay. He'd been redirecting, quietly, incrementally, in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic flags. Large enough to matter. The money had gone to 3 places: Tessa's holding account, a private gambling debt owed to a man referred to in the records only as V, and a series of cash withdrawals that Gerald's attorney described, with visible discomfort, as unaccounted for. I was at home when Rebecca called to tell me this. I was in the garden doing something I'd been meaning to do for months, pulling up the rose bushes Marcus had planted along the back fence, the ones he'd chosen because they photographed well and that I'd always found slightly aggressive, all thorns and performance. "Gerald's cooperating fully," Rebecca said. "He is giving them everything." "Good," I said. I had dirt on my hands and a pair of gardening gloves that were finally earning their keep. "There is something else." A pause. V, the name in the notebook. "We have an ID now. His name is Vincent Caro. He runs a private lending operation, not technically illegal, but the interest structures are." Another pause, more deliberate. "He knows where you live, Nora." I stopped pulling. "He has been to the house before. Not the house, he had someone watching it. Past tense, we think, but I want you to be careful." Her voice was measured, but I could hear the thing underneath it. "This is the part where I tell you that you've done everything right and the legal situation is well in hand, and I also need you to understand that Vincent Caro is not a legal situation." I stood in the garden with dirt on my gloves and looked at the back fence. "What do I do?" "You don't open the door to anyone you don't know. You don't answer calls from numbers you don't recognize, and you call me immediately if anything feels wrong." a beat. I've also taken the liberty of contacting a colleague who handles security consultations. He'll call you this afternoon. After I hung up, I stood in the garden for a long time. This was the part of the plan I hadn't fully planned for. I'd accounted for the legal pressure, the financial exposure, the social maneuvering. I'd built contingencies for most of the ways Marcus could fight back. But Vincent Caro was a different category of problem. The kind that doesn't respond to counter motions or discovery requests, the kind that shows up at the door. My hands were steady. I noticed that. I wasn't sure what it meant. I went inside, washed my hands, and waited for the security consultant to call. He called at 3. His name was Tom, and he had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had assessed a great many threatening situations and found most of them manageable. He asked me specific questions, the layout of the house, the entry points, whether I had a security system, whether I'd noticed anything unusual in the past week. I had, actually, a car I didn't recognize parked across the street 2 mornings in a row. I'd noted it without knowing why, I told Tom. "That is probably nothing," he said, in a tone that suggested it was probably something. "I am going to recommend a few changes. Nothing dramatic, mostly about visibility and routine." We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, I had a list of practical adjustments and the particular kind of calm that comes not from the absence of danger, but from having a specific response to it. That evening, I changed my routine. I left the house at a different time. I took a different route. Small things, deliberate things, the kind of adjustments that feel almost insultingly ordinary when you are making them, and that matter enormously if you ever need them to. And then, because I had learned by now that the best response to fear is work, I sat down at the desk and wrote out everything I knew about Vincent Caro's connection to Marcus, the dates, the amounts, the references in the notebook, and sent it to Rebecca in a clean, organized document. He thought I was the furniture I wrote at the top and then deleted it, because Rebecca didn't need my editorializing. She needed the facts. I gave her the facts. Rebecca filed the countermotion on Friday morning. I know this because she sent me a copy at 8:14 a.m. with a single line. Filed, "Now we wait." I was in the kitchen when I read it, standing at the counter with my mother's cup, the cracked one, still on the windowsill where I'd put it 4 days ago. I picked it up, made coffee, poured it in. The crack held. Of course it held. I was halfway through the coffee when my phone rang. Rebecca again, but it was barely 9 o'clock. Too soon for any response to the filing. The DA's office called. She said, "They want to talk to you about Marcus." I set the cup down carefully. "When?" I asked. They said as soon as possible. A pause. "Nora, this is the part where it stops being a divorce case." Outside the kitchen window, the garden looked different without the rose bushes. More open, more light getting through to the things that had been growing in their shadow. I'd been meaning to plant something else there, something that didn't require so much management. "I know," I said. "Are you ready?" I looked at the cup on the counter, at the crack that had always been there, that had held 11 years of mornings without failing. "Yes," I said. And I was. The interrogation room smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air, and Marcus looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He was already seated when they brought me in, not to the same table. I wasn't being questioned alongside him, but the layout of the building meant I walked past the open doorway of the room where he was sitting, and I saw him before he saw me. Just for a second, just long enough. He was wearing a suit. Of course he was. Even now, even here. But it was the wrong one. A charcoal jacket with a shirt that didn't quite match. The kind of combination that happens when you are dressing in a hurry, or in the dark, or in a state of mind where the details stop mattering. His hair was off. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. very still, the way hands get when their owner is working hard to appear calm. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life being the most prepared person in the room, and had finally walked into a room he hadn't prepared for. I kept walking. The DAS investigator was a woman named Solace, compact and unhurried, with the kind of eyes that don't miss much and don't advertise that they don't miss much. She offered me water. I took it. We sat across from each other at a small table, and she asked me questions for 2 hours. She was good at her job. The questions started broad and got specific in a way that felt gradual but wasn't. She was building something, laying one piece next to another, and by the end of the first hour I understood that she already knew most of what I was telling her. She wasn't gathering information. She was confirming, locking it into the record with my voice attached. I answered everything. I was precise and I was complete, and when I didn't know something I said so, which Rebecca had told me was the most important thing. Don't speculate, don't extrapolate, don't give them anything you can't document. I gave them everything I could document. The notebook, the transfer agreement, the timeline I'd constructed over 14 months of careful, quiet attention to the financial life of a man who had assumed I wasn't paying attention. When I slid the folder across the table, Solace looked at it for a moment before she opened it. "How long did it take you to put this together?" she asked. "The documentation." "About 6 months, once I had the full picture." I paused. The paying attention part was longer. She looked up from the folder. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, more like a recognition. "Miss Whitmore, Miss Calloway," I said. "I've gone back to my name." A small nod. She made a note, and I had the sense she approved, not of me personally, but of the precision. "Miss Calloway, is there anything else you think we should know?" I thought about it, genuinely thought about it, sitting in that recycled air with the burnt coffee smell and the fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly unwell. "Vincent Caro," I said, "Marcus's private lender. I don't know the full extent of that relationship, but the amounts in the notebook suggest it goes beyond a simple loan. I'd look at the timing of the withdrawals against the fund's performance reports." Solace wrote something down. "We're aware of Mr. Caro. In fact, he has been cooperative." She said it without looking up, the way you mention something that has already been handled. "His attorney made contact with our office last week. He has his own exposure in this, and he knows it. Whatever arrangement he had with your husband, that thread is already being pulled." Something in my chest loosened very slightly. Not relief exactly. More like the particular sensation of a door closing on a room you'd been keeping one eye on for weeks. "Good," I said. "I am glad it is on the record either way." She closed the folder, looked at me. "You've been very thorough." "I had time," I said, which was true. 9 years of time, most of it spent in a house where I was the furniture. And furniture sees everything. They let me out through a side door, which I appreciated. I was standing on the pavement outside, adjusting to the daylight, when I heard him. "Nora." I turned. Marcus was in the doorway. Not outside, not quite. One hand on the doorframe as if he needed it for balance. There was an officer a few feet behind him, giving us a moment that I hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want. He looked worse up close. The suit was definitely wrong. There were shadows under his eyes that no amount of careful grooming could address, and his jaw was carrying 2 days of stubble that on another occasion might have looked deliberate, and on this one just looked like evidence. "I need to ask you something," he said. I waited. "When did you know?" His voice was different from the coffee shop voice, different from the divorce proceedings voice, stripped of the rehearsal. "Not about Tessa, about the fund, about all of it. When did you actually know?" I looked at him for a moment. The first transfer I couldn't account for was in November. 3 years ago, I said. $4,000 to an account I didn't recognize. I wrote the number down and filed it. He closed his eyes briefly. I kept filing things, I said. Every month, every discrepancy, every account summary that didn't add up. You handed me the paperwork, Marcus. Every statement, every document, everything that came through the door, you handed it to me because I was the one who filed things. And filing things was just housework, and you never thought about what housework actually involves. I paused. It involves reading, it involves remembering, it involves understanding, over time, the shape of what you are looking at. He opened his eyes. They were red at the rims. I trusted you, he said. And the terrible thing was that he meant it. I could hear that he meant it, that in his version of events, he had trusted me, that he had handed me all of that paper and all of those numbers and trusted me to be the furniture, to hold things and stay still and not understand what I was holding. I know, I said. That was your mistake. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face that I didn't have a name for. Not remorse exactly, not anger. Something more complicated and less useful than either. I did love you, he said. At the beginning. I want you to know that. At the beginning, as if love were a project with a natural end date. As if the beginning were the part that counted and everything after were just maintenance. I had loved him, not the version of him that turned out to be true, but the version I'd believed in, the man who held the car door and said, "I've got you." The man who'd seemed, for a few years, like someone worth building a life around. I'd loved that man with the particular intensity of someone who doesn't love carelessly. And losing him, not to Tessa, not to the fraud, but to the slow revelation that he'd never quite existed, that loss was real. It had weight. It had taken up residence in my chest and stayed there, and I didn't think it would ever entirely leave. But grief and debt are different things. You can carry grief. You don't have to pay someone else's debt. I know you did, I said. Goodbye, Marcus. I turned and walked away from the building into the afternoon, and I didn't look back. The package was on the doorstep when I got home. Small, brown, no return address. My name in handwriting I recognize now, careful, slightly formal, the same penmanship as the holiday cards she'd sent every December for 9 years, the ones I'd always opened and placed on the mantel and never quite known what to do with. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, stood looking at it for a moment before I opened it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of old linen, was a white ceramic cup. Not my cup, not the one on the windowsill with the hairline crack. This one was newer, or at least less worn, the glaze still bright, the handle intact, but it was the same pattern, the same small painted detail around the rim. A thin line of blue, barely there, that I'd always assumed was just a manufacturing variation on my mother's cup. It wasn't a variation, it was a pair. There was a note underneath it, folded once, Dorothy's handwriting. I found this in the back of a cabinet when we were clearing the house. I believe it belonged to your mother. I don't know if you want it. I thought you should have the choice. I am sorry, Nora, for more than I know how to say. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the table and stood very still for a moment. She'd known my mother. They'd overlapped, briefly. In the early years of my marriage, a lunch, a birthday party. She'd known my mother. They'd overlapped briefly. In the early years of my marriage, a lunch, a birthday party. The ordinary social adjacency of two women whose children had married each other. She'd known about the cup. She'd kept the second one, and now she'd sent it back. I thought about what it costs a woman like Dorothy to write a note like that, to admit, even obliquely, that something had gone wrong that she'd had a hand in, to reach across the wreckage of her son's life and offer something small and irretrievable and genuine. It didn't fix anything. It wasn't meant to. It was just a gesture, the kind that doesn't ask for anything back. I picked up the new cup, turned it in my hands. The blue line around the rim matched the one on my mother's cup, exactly. I carried both cups to the counter, set them side by side, the cracked one and the whole one, the worn one and the bright one, both white, both real, both here. She'd asked me once, my mother, what I would do if things went wrong. Not with Marcus specifically, she'd never said his name in that context, but in the general way she had of asking the questions that mattered without quite asking them directly. I'd said I'd figure it out. She'd looked at me for a moment, and then she'd said, I know, I just want you to know you don't have to figure it out alone. I hadn't known what she meant then. I thought I did now. I made coffee, poured it into my mother's cup, the cracked one, the one that had been with me through all of it, stood at the window and drank it while the afternoon light did its thing across the kitchen floor. The garden looked good without the rose bushes, open a little bare still, but bare in the way of something that has been cleared for a reason, space where something else could grow. When I was ready, when I decided what I wanted there, I wasn't ready yet. That was fine, Rachel called at 6. I answered on the first ring, which I almost never do, and she noticed immediately. You okay? She said. You picked up. I am okay, I said. And then, because it was Rachel and because the kitchen was quiet and the light was good and I was tired of performing composure for an audience of one, it was a hard day, but I am okay. Do you want me to come over? I looked at the 2 cups on the counter. At the garden through the window, at Dorothy's note still on the table folded once. Not tonight, I said. But soon. Okay, she said, soon. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a while longer, not doing anything in particular, just standing in my own house, in my own quiet, in the particular quality of evening light that I had always loved and had spent 9 years sharing with someone who never once mentioned it. I picked up Dorothy's note, read it one more time, then I folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where I keep things I am not ready to throw away and not ready to file. The in-between drawer, the one that holds things that are still becoming something. Maybe it would stay there. Maybe eventually I'd know what to do with it. I picked up my mother's cup, the cracked one, finished the last of the coffee. Outside, the street was doing its evening thing. A dog walker, a kid on a bicycle, 2 neighbors talking over a fence, in the way that means nothing and means everything. The ordinary texture of a life being lived in proximity to other lives. I watched it for a while, then I rinsed the cup, set it back on the windowsill where the morning light would find it, and went to figure out what to have for dinner. It was, all things considered, a beginning. Here is what this story is actually about. It is not about betrayal. Betrayal is the surface. It is not even about revenge, though the revenge is elegant, and I will not pretend otherwise. This story is about the particular danger of being underestimated by someone who lives in your house. Marcus made the mistake that a certain kind of man makes with a certain kind of woman. He confused her usefulness with her limits. She managed his calendar, his household, his image at every dinner party. She filed his paperwork. She smoothed the edges of his life until it gleamed. And because she did all of that quietly, competently, without complaint, he concluded that quiet was all she was. He forgot that the person who files everything has read everything. He forgot that the person who manages the household accounts understands the household accounts. He forgot most critically that invisible is not the same as absent. Nora was in that house for 9 years. She was at that desk. Every document that came through the door came through her hands first. She wasn't gathering intelligence, not at first. She was just paying attention. The way women who have learned not to trust their instincts eventually learn to trust their records. Instead, the first discrepancy was $4,000 in November. Filed it, waited. That is not a woman being passive. That is a woman being patient. There is a difference, And it is the difference between the story Marcus thought he was in and the one he was actually in. What I want to say to you, and I mean this without a single drop of sentimentality, is that Nora's power in this story does not come from the countermotion, or the notebook, or the draft stock transfer agreement she'd been keeping in a fireproof box under the bed. Those are instruments. Her power comes from the decision, made quietly and early, to treat her own observations as credible, to write the number down, to keep the envelope, to not confront him before she understood the full shape of what she was looking at. She trusted herself when she had every reason not to. When the easier thing, the socially acceptable thing, the thing that keeps the peace and the marriage and the carefully curated life, would have been to assume she'd misread the account, to give him the benefit of the doubt, to decide that the 40-minute delay and the pre-dinner shower were nothing. She didn't decide they were nothing. She decided they were data. What she does with it, what she does on that kitchen floor, is feel it completely without performing composure for anyone. And then she gets up, makes tea, and goes to get the folder. That is not strength as the absence of pain. That is strength as the decision to keep moving while the pain is still present. Those are not the same thing. And the difference matters enormously. The cup with the crack in it, she'd been drinking from it every morning for 11 years without knowing it was broken. And when she found the crack, she didn't throw the cup away. She put it on the windowsill where the morning light could reach it, because it still worked. Because it had held things for 11 years with that crack in it, and the coffee had been fine. I think about that a great deal. The things that have been used, really used, worn smooth by hands and mornings and ordinary days, are not diminished by their damage. They are proven by it. Nora walks out of that building at the end into the afternoon, and she doesn't look back. Not because she isn't grieving, not because the loss isn't real, but because grief and debt are different things. You don't have to pay someone else's debt. She kept her mother's cup. She went back to her own name. She cleared the rose bushes that photographed well but were all thorns and performance. And she left the space bare for something she hadn't decided on yet. That is not a woman who has arrived somewhere. That is a woman who has cleared the ground, which is, if you ask me, the more interesting place to be now. I want to hear from you. Nora found the first discrepancy 3 years before she filed for divorce. She wrote the number down, filed it, and waited. She didn't confront him. She didn't leave. She built the case. Some of you will understand that instinctively. Some of you will find. So tell me this. At what point would you have stopped filing and started walking, and what would it have taken to get you there? I'll be reading every single one. I always do. Good night, ladies. Madam, read out.